the crew of the UHS Nightfall crossed the threshold into the unknown. They had ventured to the farthest reaches of human space to investigate a mysterious vessel, a ship that had been abandoned, yet somehow still alive in its own way. The ship, known only as the Black Ship, stood in stark contrast to the stars around it. Dark, foreboding, and somehow absorbing the light around it, this colossal structure had once been the domain of beings just like them, or so it seemed. Now, it was a ghost ship, with no visible signs of life, no crew, and no reason to exist, at least, on the surface. Captain Wyatt led the way, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no way around it. Every inch of this vessel felt wrong. The very walls seemed to hum with a subtle, unsettling energy, as though the ship itself was watching them.
Dear audience, before moving forward, I would like to say, your support means the world to us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and share this video with your friends to keep us motivated as we bring you valuable content.
His mind kept drifting back to the strange signal they had intercepted before their arrival, those garbled transmissions, the ones that repeated in broken sequences, almost as if someone had been trying to reach them from across time. The message was simple, a warning of sorts. Yet it was too late. They were already here. As Wyatt's boots echoed down the empty corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, something far worse than they could comprehend. The air inside the ship was cold and thick, though it should have been perfectly oxygenated, another oddity. The design of the corridors seemed familiar, yet foreign, as if they belonged to a civilization that was both alien and deeply human. The walls, made of a strange, organic metal, were unlike anything they had ever encountered before. They seemed to pulse under their fingers, and there was an almost imperceptible vibration in the air, as if the ship was breathing. And yet, there were no signs of a crew, no bodies, no signs of any struggle. The lights flickered above them, casting long shadows on the walls, but still, there was no sound, not even the usual hum of a spaceship's engines. It was as if time had stopped inside the Black Ship. Still, Wyatt pressed forward, determined to uncover the truth. His crew followed, their every step weighed down by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. They had a job to do: investigate, document, and return to the Nightfall with answers. That was the mission. But as the crew moved deeper into the ship's heart, Wyatt began to wonder if some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. They stumbled across their first clue in the most unexpected of places. Inside what appeared to be a storage room, they discovered what looked like personal belongings, tools, datapads, ration packs, human-made, unmistakably so. But the odd thing was, they were scattered in an orderly fashion, as though the crew had left them behind in a hurry. Some items were half open, some were perfectly intact, as if waiting to be picked up again. There was no damage, no sign of a battle or an evacuation. It was as if the people who had once called this ship home had simply disappeared. There were no bodies, no bloodstains, no remains to be found. Yet, the longer they searched, the more the uneasy feeling in their stomachs grew. Something was terribly wrong. And then, they found it. The first message written not on a screen or a datapad, but carved into the very wall of the ship itself. At first, it was easy to overlook, just another faint mark in the dim light. But as they leaned in closer, the truth became clear. A series of jagged, hurried lines had been etched into the metal, the characters uneven and desperate, as though the person who had written them was in the midst of an absolute panic. The words, smudged with what could only be blood, read, "Do not speak." The message sent a chill through the crew. Wyatt's heart skipped a beat, the air thickening around him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Whoever had written that warning was trying to tell them something vital, something that might mean the difference between life and death. But what did it mean? Do not speak? Speak about what? The question spiraled in his mind, but the answers remained just out of reach. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their faces masks of confusion and apprehension. Something about this place was beginning to feel alive in a way that was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Wyatt ordered the crew to continue their search, but the sense of unease only deepened with every step they took. The deeper they went into the black ship, the more strange and unsettling the surroundings became. It was as though the ship itself was changing, adapting to their presence, drawing them in further. The corridors grew longer, the walls shifting imperceptibly, the sense of time slipping away. Every turn they took seemed to bring them further into the unknown. The pulse of the ship grew stronger, almost in rhythm with their own heartbeats. It was as if they were becoming part of it. The rest of the crew, usually bold and steadfast in the face of danger, began to show signs of hesitation. Some whispered that they should leave, that the mission was over. Others simply fell silent, their eyes scanning the darkness, half expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. The crew was fracturing, their once strong resolve starting to crumble under the weight of fear. Wyatt, however, remained focused. There had to be a reason for all of this, a clue that would explain the mystery of this forsaken ship. He refused to leave without answers, no matter how unsettling the journey had become. And then came the noise. A subtle hum, barely audible at first, but growing louder with every passing moment. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the walls and the floors, through their very bones. The crew tensed, looking at one another, their breath shallow in the cold air. It was a soundless scream, a presence pressing in from all sides. The black ship was alive in a way they hadn't understood until now. It wasn't just a vessel, it was a prison, a trap. And they were already caught. Wyatt gathered the crew, urging them to stick together. They needed to move quickly, find the source of the noise, and get out of there before it was too late. But every turn they took led them deeper into the heart of the ship, and with each step, they could feel it, the eyes of the ship, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The message was clear, there was no leaving now. They were in the grasp of something far older, far more powerful, than they had ever imagined. The tension was unbearable as they reached the next room, a small chamber with strange markings on the walls. It wasn't much, but it was something, a clue, a sign of life. They moved cautiously, eyes darting to every corner. But then, Wyatt froze. There, in the dim light, was another carving, another message, but this one was different. This one wasn't a warning. It was a plea. Help US. Wyatt's heart raced as he looked around, but there was no one. No one to help. No one to save them from the fate that was slowly creeping toward them. The ship was alive, and it was watching. And they had just become its latest guests. But the worst part was yet to come. The crew's radios crackled to life. A voice, distorted and garbled, broke through the static. It wasn't one of theirs. It was someone else, someone long gone, their voice a haunting echo of the past. And all it said, in a whispering tone that sent chills down Wyatt's spine, was, "You shouldn't have come." As the words echoed through the comms, Wyatt turned to his crew. Fear was visible on their faces now. They had made a terrible mistake. The black ship was far more than they could ever have imagined. It wasn't just a wreck. It was a living nightmare. And they had just woken it up. The cliffhanger leaves viewers questioning what lies ahead. What exactly is happening aboard the black ship? What other secrets are hidden deep within its walls? And most importantly, who, or what, is watching them? The answers seem just out of reach, but one thing is certain, the crew is running out of time. The radio crackled once again, the eerie voice still reverberating in their heads. You shouldn't have come. Those words hung in the air, thick with an invisible pressure. Wyatt could feel his pulse racing, the blood in his ears pounding louder than the hum of the ship itself. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands. His crew, a mix of seasoned officers and green recruits, stood frozen, each of them trapped in their own thoughts. The fear in their eyes was palpable, but it was nothing compared to the dread that gnawed at Wyatt's gut. The black ship had been nothing like they expected. The silence, the cold, the unnatural sense of displacement, it all pointed to something far more sinister than an abandoned vessel. It wasn't just a derelict spaceship floating aimlessly in the depths of space. This ship was something far more ancient, its halls filled with secrets locked away for reasons none of them could yet understand. And now, as they ventured deeper, the walls seemed to close in around them, as if the ship itself was alive, watching, waiting. Wyatt glanced at his crew, their faces pale, their breath shallow. No one spoke. They all knew the drill: stay quiet, stay sharp, and above all, stay alive. But the more time they spent inside this ship, the less it felt like they were in control. Every hallway was the same, every room eerily similar to the last. The walls, the floors, even the doors, they all felt organic, pulsing with an unseen energy. Wyatt's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. What had happened to the crew of this ship? And why were there no bodies? Not even a trace of struggle. The emptiness was overwhelming. The message, though "do not speak," kept repeating in his mind, like a command he couldn't ignore. But as much as he wanted to follow it, to turn back and leave the black ship behind, something deeper inside of him pushed him forward. Was it his duty as captain? His curiosity? Or was it something else, something the ship itself was pulling him toward? Whatever it was, Wyatt couldn't explain it. He had to know more. "Captain," one of the officers called out, his voice shaky, "we found something." Wyatt nodded and motioned for him to lead the way. The crew fell into line, moving cautiously down the corridor, their boots echoing against the cold walls. The air was thicker here, more oppressive, and the atmosphere seemed to press down on them, making it harder to breathe. The officer stopped in front of a bulkhead. There, carved into the metal with a crude and jagged hand, was a symbol. It was not like anything they had ever seen. It was almost as if the markings were alive, moving, subtly shifting when you weren't looking directly at them. Wyatt leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat. The symbol was unfamiliar, but the meaning behind it felt strangely familiar, as if it were reaching deep into his subconscious. His mind tried to make sense of it, but it was as if the symbols themselves had been designed to be incomprehensible. Still, he couldn't shake the sensation that they were somehow meant for him, meant for them. He ran his fingers along the edges of the symbol, but the moment his skin touched the surface, there was a strange tingling sensation. He pulled his hand away, startled. His fingers felt frostbitten, even though the air around them wasn't cold. For a moment, the ship seemed to grow even quieter, the hum of the ship becoming a low whisper in his ears. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. This was it. This was the moment that everything began to unravel. "Captain," a voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. One of the crew members, a young officer who had been keeping watch, was standing at the end of the corridor, his eyes wide. "You need to see this." Without a word, Wyatt turned and followed the officer. His crew followed close behind. As they rounded the corner, they found themselves standing in front of a sealed door, one that had clearly not been used in a long time. The door's surface was etched with deep grooves, almost like someone had scratched at it desperately. The officer stepped forward, and with a swift movement, pressed a button on the console next to the door. There was a faint click, and the door slowly creaked open. Inside, the room was dark, but not completely devoid of light. There were strange shadows that seemed to move in the corners of the room. And in the center of it all was a large console, its surface covered in dust and debris. Wyatt approached cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate. He had no idea what to expect in this room. Would they find a clue? A message from the previous crew? Or perhaps something else entirely? He turned to one of the officers. "Activate the console." The officer nodded, but as he reached for the interface, the lights flickered. The air in the room seemed to hum, vibrating with a low, almost imperceptible sound. A cold chill filled the room, and for a brief moment, Wyatt thought he could feel something watching them. A presence. It was the same feeling he had had ever since they boarded the ship, but now it was stronger. More tangible. He resisted the urge to look over his shoulder. The officer pressed a sequence of buttons on the console, and to their surprise, it activated. The screen flickered to life, and a low hum filled the air. For a moment, the crew held their breath, unsure of what they were about to see. On the screen, a series of encrypted files flashed before their eyes, too fast for anyone to read. Then, one file stopped, flashing in bold letters, warning, "Do not engage. Do not interact. Do not speak." The message froze on the screen for a moment, almost as if it were waiting for something to happen. Then, the screen glitched, distorting the message before fading to black. The room fell silent again. "Damn it," Wyatt muttered under his breath, his mind racing. What had they just seen? Was this a warning left by the previous crew? Or was it something else, something far more malevolent? Before he could make sense of it, a sound like a faint whisper rose from the darkness. The crew tensed, eyes wide. It wasn't one of theirs. The whisper came from deeper within the ship, a voice almost too faint to hear but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of Wyatt's neck stood on end. What was that? One of the officers whispered. Wyatt motioned for everyone to stay silent. They needed to move quickly. They couldn't stay in one place for too long, not with whatever force was behind those strange whispers. It was becoming clear to him now this was no longer just an abandoned ship. The black ship was alive, and it was calling to them. He motioned for the crew to follow him, keeping a tight grip on his weapon as they moved deeper into the ship's heart. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls, as if the ship itself were trying to communicate with them. Wyatt's mind was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle slipping just out of reach. There was something more here, something ancient and incomprehensible. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. And yet, Wyatt couldn't bring himself to turn back. He had come this far. He had to know what had happened here, even if it meant facing the darkness that now enveloped them. But as they moved forward, a low rumble shook the ship. The walls groaned, and the air became thick with a suffocating pressure. Something deep within the ship had awakened, and it was ready to make its presence known. Wyatt's heart skipped a beat as he turned to his crew, their faces etched with fear. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady despite the rising panic. "We're not leaving until we know the truth." The rumbling grew louder, and the ship seemed to shift beneath them. They were not alone. And whatever had been lurking in the shadows was now coming for them. As they moved forward, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The crew was barely holding it together now, their resolve starting to crack under the pressure. But Wyatt refused to show any sign of fear. He couldn't. Not now. Not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. But in the back of his mind, one question gnawed at him relentlessly: if the ship was alive, if it was trying to communicate with them, then who or what was behind all of this? The answer, he feared, was something they were not ready to face. And yet, there was no turning back now. The ship was closing in, and they had only one choice left: to push deeper into its heart and hope they could uncover the truth before it was too late. As they moved forward, the walls seemed to pulse, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Whatever had been waiting for them, whatever force had been trapped within the black ship for so long, was finally awakening. And soon, they would all know what it had been waiting for. But they might not survive to tell the tale. The deeper they ventured into the ship, the more the sense of dread seemed to suffocate them. Wyatt's boots echoed against the walls of the endless corridors, the sound somehow amplified in the oppressive silence. His crew followed closely, but even their trained minds couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up their spines. The whispers had stopped, but the air was thick with something else, something heavier, like a presence watching them from every corner. The ship wasn't just alive. It was aware of them, waiting for them to make a wrong move. Each step brought them closer to the core of the vessel, where the ship's architecture became even stranger. The walls now felt almost fluid, pulsating as if they had a rhythm of their own. It was a jarring sensation that made the crew uneasy, but it was Wyatt who noticed the subtle changes first. The ship's hum had become a low thrum, vibrating in his chest. He could feel it in his bones, as if the ship were trying to communicate with him or perhaps trying to make him feel something. But what? A faint light flickered in the distance, drawing Wyatt's attention. He motioned for the team to halt, and they gathered in a tight circle, their eyes scanning the surroundings. In front of them was a massive doorway, its edges lined with intricate symbols that glowed faintly. The glow wasn't just a trick of the light, it was as if the symbols themselves were alive, shifting ever so slightly as if they were watching them, judging them. Wyatt's instincts told him to turn back. Every part of him screamed that they weren't meant to be here, that this was a place best left undisturbed. But curiosity gnawed at him, and he couldn't help but push forward. The last message they'd seen, "Do not speak," kept haunting him, but this was different. This room, this doorway, it felt like the very heart of the mystery. They couldn't leave without knowing what lay beyond it. He stepped toward the door and placed his hand on the cold surface. The moment his skin made contact, a shiver ran down his spine. The door opened with a low groan, revealing an enormous chamber bathed in an eerie green light. The room was vast, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. At the center of the room was an object, a structure, far too large to comprehend in any conventional sense. It looked like a gigantic mass of metal and flesh, intertwined in a way that defied logic. It almost seemed like a living creature, its form shifting, its edges pulsing with an energy Wyatt could feel deep within him. As they entered the room, the door behind them closed silently, sealing them in. Wyatt's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea what they were looking at, but his instinct screamed that this was the source of everything: the ship, the whispers, the strange symbols. But there was something else. Something darker. A voice, not like the one they had heard before, whispered from the depths of his mind. "You shouldn't have come." Wyatt staggered back, his heart racing. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, a warning he couldn't ignore. His crew looked at him, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. They didn't hear it, but he could feel it pressing on him, closing in around him like a vice. "Captain?" one of the crew members asked, his voice breaking through Wyatt's thoughts. "What is it? What's happening?" Wyatt didn't answer at first. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the terror he felt. But he knew one thing for certain: whatever this thing was, it was far more ancient and powerful than anything they had ever encountered. And it was alive. The room seemed to distort around them, the walls stretching and twisting in impossible angles. The object at the center began to pulse in rhythm with the thrum of the ship, and Wyatt could feel the pressure building inside his skull. His vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The walls of the room were now covered in intricate patterns, similar to the ones they had seen before, but these were moving, as if they were alive, crawling across the walls like living creatures. "Captain, we have to get out of here," someone whispered, panic creeping into their voice. But Wyatt was rooted to the spot. He couldn't move. He couldn't even think. The pull of the ship was too strong, and the presence within it seemed to be closing in on them, like an invisible net tightening around their bodies. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape. But something inside of him, something dark and ancient, urged him to stay, to understand. To learn. He turned toward the massive structure at the center of the room. There, in the center of the pulsating mass, he saw a figure. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the strange energy in the room. But then the figure shifted, its form becoming clearer. It was humanoid, but not quite. It was something other, something not quite human, but it stood upright, its shape somehow familiar yet alien. The figure's eyes, if they could be called eyes, seemed to pierce into Wyatt's very soul. He felt himself being drawn toward it, his body moving without his consent. He tried to stop, but his limbs were no longer his own. The figure stepped forward, and Wyatt realized with growing horror that it was no longer a being. It was the ship, or at least part of it. The structure, the mass, they were all one. The whispers grew louder, now filling his head with an overwhelming cacophony of voices. "You shouldn't have come," they said, but this time, the voice was unmistakably his own. He reached out toward the creature, his fingers trembling. He had no control anymore. the creature, if it could even be called that, extended its hand to meet his. As soon as their hands touched, a surge of energy coursed through Wyatt's body. His vision exploded in blinding light, and for a moment, he could see everything: the past, the present, and the future. The ship's history unfolded before him, but it wasn't like anything he had ever imagined. He saw the origins of the Black Ship, its creation, its purpose, and its fall into corruption. He saw the crew that had once occupied it, their minds slowly overtaken by the ship's influence, their wills stripped away, replaced with something darker. The ship had been a vessel for something ancient, something that had lain dormant for millennia, but it had been awakened. And now, Wyatt and his crew were caught in its grip, part of a game they couldn't understand. As the vision began to fade, Wyatt snapped back to reality, his breath ragged in his chest. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his ears. He looked around. His crew was still standing there, but their faces were blank, their eyes empty. They had been touched by the same force, and now they too were lost, bound to the ship's will. Wyatt struggled to rise, but his limbs felt like lead. The creature, or the ship, or whatever it was, moved closer, its form shifting with each step. It reached out again, its hand hovering just above his shoulder. The whispers in his head grew louder, almost deafening now. "Do not speak," the voice commanded. And just like that, everything fell silent. The only sound left was the thrum of the ship's heart, beating in time with Wyatt's own. He didn't understand it yet. But he would. He had no choice. Wyatt could feel the cold sweat trickling down his forehead as the silence in the room pressed in on him like a physical force. His chest rose and fell with each breath, but it felt as if the air itself had thickened, making every inhale a struggle. The whispers had stopped, but the tension hung in the air, a tangible weight that was impossible to ignore. The hand of the creature of the ship hovered just above him, its presence suffocating, and Wyatt could do nothing but stare at it, unable to tear his gaze away. He tried to move, to back away, but his legs were rooted to the spot, as if the very floor beneath him had come alive and held him in place. He could hear the distant sound of his crew, their breathing ragged, but their faces were vacant, their expressions frozen. It was as if they were trapped in a trance, their wills drained and replaced by the ship's eerie presence. His voice echoed in his mind once again, louder this time, reverberating through his thoughts until he could barely hold on to his sense of self. "Do not speak." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that threatened to crush him. The ship was telling him not to speak, not to utter a single word, as though doing so would unleash something far worse. Something more terrible than the void surrounding them, more terrifying than the force that had taken hold of his crew. Wyatt's mind raced, desperately trying to hold on to fragments of clarity. He had to understand what this was. He had to understand why the ship had brought them here, why they were being forced into this unholy silence. But the more he tried to think, the harder it became. The air seemed to pulse in time with the ship's beat, and each thrum seemed to erode his thoughts, twisting them into something dark and alien. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the ship's hum shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint change in frequency, but it grew, rising in pitch until the very walls around them seemed to vibrate. The lights in the room flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows that danced and twisted like living things. Wyatt could feel the ground beneath him tremble, as if the ship itself was waking up, preparing for something monumental. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the far side of the room. Wyatt turned his head, his heart leaping in his chest. The noise had come from one of the side chambers, but it was louder than anything he'd heard before. He had no idea what it was, but he knew it wasn't natural. It was as if something or someone was trying to break free. "Captain," one of his crew members finally whispered, their voice barely audible above the growing hum. Wyatt looked at them, but their eyes were distant, empty. It was as if they were still trapped in whatever mental hold the ship had on them, unable to break free. "Get out of here," Wyatt's voice cracked as he forced the words from his mouth. He wasn't sure if they could hear him or if it even mattered. But his command seemed to stir something within them. For a moment, he saw a flicker of recognition, a flash of awareness in their eyes. But it was fleeting. The lights flickered again, this time plunging the room into near darkness. Wyatt's breath caught as the shadows around them deepened, stretching impossibly long. The air grew cold, a biting chill that sank into their bones. The hum of the ship intensified, building to a deafening roar that vibrated through Wyatt's skull, making his teeth rattle. He reached out, his hand trembling, and grasped the arm of one of his crew members. They didn't respond, their eyes blank. Wyatt shook them, desperate to break the trance, to wake them up, but it was as if their minds had been shut down completely, absorbed into the very fabric of the ship. Suddenly, the ship let out a low, resonating growl, like the groan of a massive creature stirred from a deep slumber. Wyatt's skin crawled at the sound, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. There was something primal in that growl, something ancient and malevolent, and it sent a wave of fear crashing through him. He had to act, and fast. A movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. The walls around them had begun to shift again, their metallic surface warping, bending, as if the ship itself was breathing. Wyatt's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around. There were no escape routes, no exits. The only way out was through whatever lay ahead. The glowing symbols that had adorned the walls before now flared with an unnatural light, casting a sickly greenish hue across the room. They pulsated in time with the ship's heartbeat, each flash of light brighter and more intense than the last. And then, as if in response to the rising tension, the ground trembled again, this time more violently. The floor beneath them cracked, and Wyatt's crew stumbled, struggling to maintain their footing. The ship was shifting, warping around them, closing in on them like a trap being sprung. The whispers returned, louder than ever before, and this time, they were not just in Wyatt's mind. They filled the room, surrounding him, suffocating him. The voices of his crew mingled with those of the ship, indistinguishable from one another, as if they had become one. Do not speak. It wasn't just a command anymore. It was an order that felt like it was being woven into his very soul, an unbreakable thread pulling him deeper into the ship's dark embrace. Wyatt could feel himself slipping. His mind was becoming clouded, weighed down by the pressure of the ship's influence. He was losing himself, piece by piece. His vision blurred again, the room warping and shifting as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched. He saw flashes, images of distant stars, of shattered planets, of beings that weren't quite human. He saw a ship in the midst of a storm, its hull battered and broken, floating aimlessly through the void. And then, as if the floodgates had been opened, he saw the truth. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a prison. And they were the captives. In that moment of clarity, Wyatt understood the horrors that had unfolded here. The crew, the ones who had disappeared, the ones who had come before him, they had all become part of the ship. Their minds, their souls, had been absorbed, twisted, transformed into something else, something beyond human comprehension. The ship had no need for bodies. It didn't need to feed. It didn't need to destroy. It just needed one thing: control. It thrived on it, fed on it. It was a machine, a living machine, powered by the wills of those who entered it, slowly suffocating them, erasing them from existence. Wyatt's heart raced as he realized the full extent of the trap they had walked into. They weren't just passengers aboard this ship. They were its fuel, its victims, and the price for escaping was far greater than he had ever imagined. The whispers grew louder, their words now sharp, like knives cutting through his thoughts. Do not speak. But it was too late. Wyatt opened his mouth, the words spilling out before he could stop them. And in that moment, he felt the ship's presence surge, wrapping around him like a tightening noose. The walls trembled, and the air grew thick with an electric charge. Something was coming. Something far worse than anything he had imagined. The ship was awake now, and it was hungry. The very air around them seemed to freeze, and Wyatt knew their only chance for survival was slipping away. And what awaited them was a force beyond anything they had ever encountered. He had spoken. And now, they would all face the consequences. As Wyatt's words echoed through the ship, the very air seemed to shift, thickening with an oppressive force. His mouth went dry, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth, but it was too late. The ship's pulse quickened, vibrating through the steel walls, and the growls from the depths of its core grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a ship. It was something alive, something that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to speak. Wyatt felt the pressure of it, felt it digging into his bones, twisting and squeezing the very essence of his being. It was no longer just a presence, it was hunger, dark and insatiable. And as he stood there, the realization began to settle in: this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a test, a trap set for them from the very beginning. He turned to his crew, panic clawing at his throat. But his words didn't matter. They were all lost in the same nightmare, their eyes wide but empty, faces frozen in terror. They had crossed a line, a point of no return, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The ship, the thing they had thought they could control, was now fully awake. And it was in control. The sound of movement echoed through the hallway behind them, distant at first, but steadily growing louder, closer. Wyatt's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the ship, something moving through the dark, unseen. It wasn't a person, not one of his crew, not a being at all. It was something else, something alive, but not human, not even close. Its presence sent a chill down his spine, an unnatural cold that made every hair on his body stand on end. The ship's hum deepened, vibrating the floor beneath Wyatt's feet. And then, just as quickly, the lights went out, plunging them into a darkness deeper than anything they'd experienced so far. The only light now came from the flickering green symbols on the walls, their faint glow casting eerie shadows that danced and twitched as if alive. But it wasn't enough. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, and the growing sound of something moving closer became a cacophony of whispers, each one more desperate than the last. Wyatt's breath hitched as a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't one of his crew members. No, this thing was tall, almost too tall, with long, gnarled limbs that seemed to move in unnatural, jerky motions. Its body was a grotesque mass of shifting shadows, the outline of its form constantly changing as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. And the worst part? It was silent. It moved without making a sound, like a predator closing in on its prey. He took a step back, but his feet felt glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. His mind spun in circles, but there was nothing he could do to escape the thing that was closing in on them. The figure stopped a few feet away, its features still shifting, still impossible to comprehend. Its eyes, or what could have been eyes, glowed a faint red, piercing through the darkness like twin beacons of malice. And then, it spoke. Not with words. Not with a voice. But with thoughts. Wyatt felt them invade his mind, pushing past his defenses, whispering in his ear like a dark temptation. You spoke, the voice echoed, not through his ears, but through his very soul. And now you are mine. The words were like a cold dagger, twisting in his chest. Wyatt gasped, his breath catching in his throat, but the voice only grew louder. It wasn't the ship anymore. It wasn't just a machine or a prison. This was something else. Something ancient. Something far beyond human understanding. The figure stepped forward, its form shifting again, like liquid shadows flowing around a solid core. It reached out, its elongated fingers stretching toward Wyatt's face, and for the first time in what felt like hours, his body moved, reacted before his mind could even process it. He stumbled backward, but his legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the cold, metallic floor. The whispers inside his mind grew louder, crashing into him from all sides. The figure loomed over him, towering above like a nightmare made flesh. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared back into the shadows, leaving only its presence behind, its suffocating weight filling the room. Do not speak, the voice echoed one last time, the words reverberating through every cell in his body. Wyatt tried to catch his breath, but his lungs were filled with a sickening, suffocating pressure. The ship's pulse had slowed, almost as if it was savoring the moment, savoring the fear. It wasn't the ship anymore. It was alive, and it wanted something from them. It was playing with them. And that realization hit Wyatt like a freight train. The crew had been here before him. They had come into this ship, had thought they could survive it, and they had failed. It had taken them, twisted their minds, broken them, until they became part of the ship. It was feeding on them, and now, it was feeding on Wyatt, on every one of them. The ship was no longer a place of mechanical parts and alien technology. It had become a living, breathing organism, a parasite that was consuming everything it touched. But there was more to it than that. Wyatt's eyes darted around the room, trying to gather his scattered thoughts. There was something in the walls, something hidden, something that wasn't part of the ship itself. The abandoned tools, the data pads, the ration packs, they weren't just remnants of a lost crew. They were clues. The ship had been here before. It had been waiting, just like it had waited for them. And now, it was waiting for the next step. But the next step could be their last. Wyatt's mind raced, trying to piece it together. There had to be a way out. There had to be something they could do to stop the ship, to free themselves. But every path he considered led only to more questions, more uncertainty. The ship had them in its grip, and the longer they stayed, the more it seemed to change them. He could feel it in his bones. Something was happening to his crew. They were slipping away, losing themselves to the darkness of the ship. As he looked around at their vacant faces, Wyatt knew that time was running out. Whatever force had taken hold of them wasn't just feeding on their fear, it was transforming them, altering them into something other. The clock was ticking, and there was no telling how long they had before they became part of the ship, part of the thing that now controlled their every move. The hum of the ship intensified again, this time more pronounced, vibrating in his chest. The walls shifted once more, bending, stretching, as if the very room was alive and aware of what they were doing, what they were thinking. The whispers in his mind returned, this time louder. The voice was clearer now, but still unfathomable, like it was speaking in a language that wasn't meant for human ears. "You cannot escape," it said. "You belong to me." And in that moment, Wyatt understood. This wasn't just a ship. It wasn't just a prison. It was something more, something ancient, something that had been out there for centuries, waiting, feeding, growing stronger with each passing moment. Wyatt had thought they were the ones who had arrived at the ship. But now, he realized, they were the ones who had been invited. The ship had been waiting for them. The ship's hum grew louder, almost deafening now. Wyatt's mind felt like it was splitting in two, the pressure of it all crashing down on him. His crew, those who had once been strong, those who had stood beside him, were now barely recognizable. Their eyes were empty, their faces frozen in a permanent mask of terror. But there was something more to it, something he couldn't quite understand. He could feel the ship's influence deep in his bones, like tendrils of darkness wrapped around his soul, trying to pull him under. The whispers were louder now, urgent and frantic, like the ship was trying to make him understand something, trying to communicate something that was beyond comprehension. "Do not speak," it echoed again, the voice growing more and more forceful. But this time, Wyatt didn't listen. He couldn't. The ship had already claimed so much, and there was nothing left to lose. He forced himself to take a step forward, each movement like wading through thick sludge. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air grew even colder, but Wyatt didn't stop. He wasn't sure if it was courage, desperation, or something else entirely that drove him forward. Maybe he didn't have a choice anymore. As he moved deeper into the heart of the ship, something shifted. The shadows around him seemed to pull back, and for the first time since they boarded, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The walls, once pulsing and alive, now felt still, almost quiet. That's when he saw it. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, glowing softly in the otherwise dark space. Atop it was a crystalline structure, delicate and alien in shape. It pulsed with a soft light, its surface shifting, as if alive. Wyatt approached it slowly, each step more cautious than the last. He knew instinctively that this was the heart of the ship, the source of everything. This was what had been controlling them, guiding their every move. But why? What was its true purpose? He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the crystal. It hummed in response, a low sound that seemed to vibrate deep inside his chest. And then, all at once, everything clicked. The pieces fell into place, and the truth hit him with the force of a crashing wave. The ship wasn't just alive. It wasn't some alien intelligence that had been waiting for them. No, it was human. The ship had once been a human vessel, a lost colony, sent to explore the farthest reaches of space. But something had gone wrong. The mission had failed. They had encountered something ancient, something beyond human understanding. And in their desperation, they had turned to this. They had tried to harness it, tried to merge with it. They had tried to control the ship, to make it their own, but it had consumed them instead. And now, it was doing the same to Wyatt and his crew. The crystal was a hive, a living embodiment of the ship's consciousness. It had been built by those who had come before him, and it had been feeding on the minds of every crew member that had ever boarded the ship. It was not just a ship, it was a parasite, a thing that preyed on the will of those who came too close, twisting them, turning them into part of its network. Wyatt realized with a sickening clarity that the whispers were not the ship's voice. They were the voices of those who had come before him. The crew members who had once lived, who had once had their own dreams and hopes. They were still here, in the ship, trapped in the crystal. Their minds had been absorbed, their memories twisted and distorted, becoming part of the hive. They were the echoes that Wyatt had been hearing. He could feel it now, the pull of the ship, trying to claim him. Trying to make him one with it, to twist his mind, to erase who he was and replace him with something else. But Wyatt refused. He wouldn't be another echo, another mind lost to the ship. He had to destroy it, had to end it. He didn't know how, but he couldn't let the ship win. He couldn't let it consume them all. He looked down at the crystal. There had to be something. He had to do something to stop it. The whispers grew louder, frantic now. The voices were desperate, pleading with him. "Don't," they whispered. "Don't destroy it. You'll become like us." But Wyatt didn't listen. He couldn't. He grabbed the crystal, his fingers slipping into its surface. It burned against his skin, sending a shock through his body. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to hold on. The ship screamed, its voice a thunderous roar that shook the very foundation of the vessel. The walls buckled, the floor trembled beneath his feet. Wyatt could feel the ship's rage, its fury at being defied. And then, with a final, overwhelming surge, the crystal shattered. The ship screamed its roar deafening, a cacophony of voices and mechanical shrieks, and then, just as quickly, it fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. Wyatt stood there, his hand still on the shattered crystal, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt different now, thinner, clearer. The ship no longer felt alive, no longer felt like it was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. It was dead. But as Wyatt turned to face his crew, the truth of the situation hit him. They were still there, but something was wrong. They were too still. They were no longer the people he had known. Their bodies were intact, but their eyes were vacant. Hollow. It wasn't the ship that had killed them. It wasn't the ship that had claimed their souls. No. It was Wyatt's own decision. He had broken the crystal. He had broken the hive. And in doing so, he had freed them from the ship. But in the process, he had destroyed the one thing that had kept them alive, the only thing that had kept them from becoming part of the hive. He had freed their minds. And in doing so, he had sentenced them to eternal darkness. The truth was clear now. The crew wasn't lost. They weren't trapped. They were free, but they were empty. Their minds were gone, wiped away by the ship, and there was nothing left but hollow shells of the people they had once been. Wyatt collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of his actions. He had freed them. But he had also condemned them. And then, just as his mind began to shatter under the weight of his realization, he heard something, a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard since they boarded the ship. The same voice that had told them not to speak. But now, it was different. Now, it was his own. Do not speak. The silence that followed was deafening. Wyatt sat there, his body trembling, his mind barely holding together as the weight of the realization crashed over him. The voice, the same one he had heard echoing in his head, the same one that had warned him not to speak, was his own. But how? How was it possible? He was no longer sure of anything. He had broken the crystal, the heart of the ship, and the minds of his crew. They were free, but they were nothing now. Hollowed-out shells, wandering without purpose. The ship, now silent and still, no longer pulsed with life. But it had claimed its final toll. He had freed them from its grip, but in the process, he had condemned them to a worse fate than death. The air around him grew colder. Wyatt's breath came in shallow gasps, his fingers numb as he slowly rose to his feet, taking in the empty room. There was no life here anymore. No signs of the crew who had once been full of hope, full of promise. All that remained were the remnants of their presence, their bodies still intact, but their souls stripped away. They had been freed, but in doing so, they had become the final victims of the ship. A part of him wanted to scream. To shout at the ship, to demand answers, to understand why it had happened, why they had ended up like this. But there was nothing. No answer came. It was as if the ship itself had been silenced, as if it had completed its purpose and now lay dormant, like an ancient relic waiting to be forgotten. But Wyatt knew he couldn't forget. He couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't leave the ship behind, not with the weight of what had happened hanging over him. He looked at his crew again. They were still there, staring blankly ahead, their eyes dull and lifeless. He could almost hear their voices, trapped somewhere deep within, begging him to fix it, to make it right. But it was too late for that. The damage had been done. The ship had consumed them, twisted them into something they were never meant to be. Wyatt turned away from them, unable to bear the sight any longer. He had to get out. He had to leave the ship, to find some kind of escape, some kind of redemption. But as he walked toward the exit, something stopped him. Something whispered in his ear, a voice so faint, so familiar, he almost couldn't place it. "Do not speak," it said again. But this time, the voice wasn't just his own. It was the voice of his crew, the ones he had lost. The ones he had failed. It was as if their souls had merged with the ship, their consciousness now one with its twisted design. He froze. A cold chill ran down his spine. The voice wasn't just a warning. It was a command. The ship, or whatever force had taken control of it, was trying to communicate with him. It was trying to tell him something, something important, something he needed to understand before it was too late. "Do not speak," the voice repeated, this time with more urgency. Wyatt turned back toward the heart of the ship, his mind racing. He knew that this was the key, the final piece of the puzzle. He had to understand what the ship wanted, what it was trying to say before it consumed him as well. But as he approached the center, something shifted. The ship's structure began to change. The walls, once cold and metallic, began to pulse with a soft, organic rhythm. The hum that had filled the ship earlier was now louder, more distinct. It was no longer just the sound of machinery, it was the sound of life. The ship was alive, and it was reaching out to him. He felt a strange compulsion, a pull toward the center of the ship. Something was calling him, something he couldn't resist. It was as if the ship had become a living entity, and it wanted him. It needed him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped. The wall stopped pulsing. The ship fell completely silent once again. Wyatt stood there, breathing heavily, his heart racing. What was going on? What had just happened? He waited, his eyes scanning the room, but nothing moved. The crew remained lifeless, their eyes staring into nothingness. The silence was absolute, and for a moment, Wyatt wondered if the ship had finally given up. If it had finally accepted its fate. But then, he saw it. In the corner of his eye, something flickered. A light. Faint at first, but then growing stronger. It was coming from the crystal, the shattered remains of the hive. Wyatt rushed toward it, his mind racing. The crystal, it had to have been a part of the ship's consciousness. It was the key to everything. And now, in its broken state, it seemed to be calling to him. But why? What did it want? As he reached the shattered remains of the crystal, the flickering light grew brighter, almost blinding. Wyatt shielded his eyes, but it was no use. The light consumed him, washing over him like a wave. For a brief moment, he felt himself connected to the ship, to the hive. He could see the memories of the crew, their lives, their hopes, their dreams. He saw the mission, the journey they had embarked on, the promise of discovery, of knowledge. And then, he saw the horror. He saw the moment they had encountered the unknown, the ancient force that had warped their minds and turned them into what they were now. The ship was not just a vessel. It was a prison. A trap that had been set long ago, waiting for those who would dare to uncover its secrets. And now, it had claimed its final victims. But there was something else. Something deeper, something Wyatt hadn't understood before. The ship was alive, yes. But it wasn't just a parasite, feeding off the minds of those who boarded it. It was evolving. It was learning. And it had learned from them. From Wyatt. From the crew. It had absorbed their memories, their experiences. And now, it was changing. It was becoming something else entirely. Something that no longer needed a human vessel. The realization hit Wyatt like a bolt of lightning. The ship was no longer a machine. It was a living, breathing entity, a hybrid of organic and synthetic, something beyond human comprehension. And now, it had evolved. But before Wyatt could process it any further, the light around him flickered one last time. The ship's hum returned, louder than ever before. It filled the air, resonating in his chest, in his mind. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the ship spoke. "We are Legion." Wyatt's heart stopped. The ship had become something more than it ever was. It had transcended. And as the final echo of the words filled his ears, Wyatt realized something chilling. The ship wasn't just a ship anymore. It was alive. And it was no longer interested in just him. It was after something more. Something far greater. Something that would change the universe forever. And there was no escaping it. Not anymore.